The ship landed like a threat. No warning. No signal. No polite request for a docking lane. The Kreth warship simply dropped through the clouds above Vrethkai, prime, and settled onto the neutral ground outside the diplomatic compound like a boot pressing down on an insect. The ground shook. The windows of the human compound rattled in their frames. 3 junior diplomats spilled their coffee. Director Elara Voss did not spill hers. She stood at the wide observation window on the 2nd floor and watched the ship with the same expression she used for everything, calm, steady, and unreadable. She was 61 years old. She had negotiated with 4 different alien civilizations. She had once talked a separatist faction out of bombing a fuel station by sharing a meal with their leader for 6 hours. People who did not know her thought she was cold. People who did know her understood she was simply always thinking. Behind her, the room was loud. Senior Dominic Park was already pulling up the ship registry on his datapad. 2 security officers were moving toward the exits. A communications officer was trying to reach the Kreth delegation that was supposed to already be inside the building, sitting at the table and not arriving in a warship that had just cracked. 3 paving stones on the landing pad. Voss watched the ship. A ramp descended from its underbelly. Kreth soldiers marched out in formation, tall, gray-skinned, and wearing the dark, ceremonial armor that meant this was not a casual visit. Behind the soldiers came a delegation of 6 in diplomatic robes. Behind the diplomats came Executor Voss. Voss was the highest military authority in the Kreth Dominion. He should not have been here. The negotiation had been assigned to a mid-level diplomatic envoy named Kreth, which already felt like an insult. Voss arriving in person meant the Kreth were done being subtle. He walked like a man who had never once in his life considered the possibility of losing. His shoulders were back. His chin was up. His eyes moved across the compound with the slow confidence of someone taking inventory of what he was about to own. Voss turned from the window. Park looked up from his datapad. He was 34, sharp, nervous, and extremely good at his job. Right now, his job was not comforting him at all. Something is behind the ship, he said. Something big. The heat signatures are. The sound hit before he finished the sentence. It was not a roar, exactly. It was lower than that. It moved through the floor, through the walls, through the chest cavity, like a hand reaching in and squeezing. Several people in the room flinched without meaning to. One of the security officers took 3 fast steps toward the door before he caught himself and stopped. The sound came from a container. It was enormous. Longer than 2 transport shuttles placed end to end and taller than the compound's outer wall. It was made of dark reinforced metal and covered in what looked like restraint cables as thick as a human arm. The container moved on a heavy-wheeled platform pulled by 4 separate Kreth vehicles. Even the vehicles looked uncomfortable. Something inside the container hit the wall. The whole compound shook. Voss walked to the window again and looked at the container for a long time. She looked at the way the Kreth soldiers stood around it, not guarding it but standing away from it, the way you stand away from a fire that is bigger than you expected. She looked at the cables. She looked at the ventilation slits on the container walls and the dark staining around them. She had read the intelligence reports on the Vrethkai 3 years ago when humanity first made contact with the Kreth Dominion. She had read them the way you read about something that exists in another part of the universe and is therefore not your immediate problem. The Vrethkai was a bioengineered apex predator. The Kreth had created it over centuries of genetic manipulation. It stood nearly 4 meters at the shoulder. Its hide was layered like natural armor. Its spines along the back and neck delivered a venom that caused complete neurological shutdown in most known species within 90 seconds. Its sonic shriek operated on a frequency that caused immediate disorientation, loss of motor control, and an prolonged exposure, permanent psychological Damage. The Kreth had used it 11 times in recorded history. All 11 times, the opposing civilization had surrendered before the container was even opened. It was not a weapon exactly. It was a statement. It was the Kreth saying, "We are done talking. We are done pretending this is a conversation between equals. Look at what we have. Look at what we are willing to release. Now sign the agreement and give us what we want." The Outer Reach colonies. 17 human settlements. 240,000 people. That was what the Kreth wanted. They wanted to absorb the Outer Reach into Dominion territory as a buffer zone, a resource corridor, and most importantly as proof that humanity could be pushed. Voss had been here for 9 days, refusing politely. Now Voss was here personally, with the Vrethkai in a box, and the message was very clear. Stop refusing. Park appeared beside her. He was looking at the container. He was not doing a good job of hiding that his hands were shaking. "Director," he said. Protocol in a situation like this would be. Voss was not listening to him. She was looking at the container. Not at its size. Not at the cables. She was looking at the ventilation slits and the way the staining around them was old and dark and layered, like it had been building up for a long time. She was looking at the way the creature moved inside. Not in the fluid, powerful way a healthy animal moves, but in the repetitive, hitting, banging, lurching way of something that is not well. She had grown up on a farm. Not a romantic countryside farm. A working livestock operation in rural Manitoba, with 300 animals and a father who said, "You can tell everything about a creature by the way it moves when it thinks no one is watching." The Vrethkai was not moving like a weapon. It was moving like something in pain. Voss picked up her communicator. She was quiet for a moment in the way. She was always quiet before she made a decision that everyone else in the room would think was insane. "Get me Dr. Harlan," she said. "Tell him to bring the big kit. Tell him we have a large animal in distress, and I want him on the ground here in 6 hours." Park stared at her. The Kreth just deployed a living extinction event outside our building, he said. "And you were calling a vet?" Voss looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Because something out there is suffering, and we are not the kind of people who ignore that. Not even when it is inconvenient. Not even when it scares us. Not even when the entire Kreth Dominion is standing behind it with their arms crossed, waiting for us to run." She looked back at the container. And because she said quietly, "If we run now, we will never stop running." Outside, the container hit the wall again. The compound shook. The Kreth soldiers stood in formation, proud and certain and completely sure they had already won. They had no idea what they had just rolled up to the door of humanity's negotiating table. They had no idea what was coming. Not the beast. The man with the medical kit. R2Dr. Cormac Harlan arrived the way he always arrived, late by everyone else's standards and exactly on time by his own. His shuttle touched down 6 hours and 14 minutes after Voss made the call. He came down the ramp carrying a case that had been patched and repatched so many times it looked more scar tissue than metal. He had a thermos of coffee in his left hand and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, even though he was outside, and there was nothing to read. He was 58 years old and built like a man who had spent decades doing physical work and was no longer in a hurry to prove it. His gray hair was cut short. His jacket had a tear along the left shoulder that he had sewn up himself badly. He looked at the compound. He looked at the Kreth warship. He looked at the container. He took a long sip of coffee. Then he walked forward with the easy, unbothered stride of a man who had been called to worse situations and survived all of them. Park met him at the compound gate. Park was holding a datapad and had the expression of a person who had not slept and was not entirely sure he was making good decisions. He had been told the vet was coming. He had imagined someone different. Younger, perhaps. More visibly prepared for the reality of what was in that container. Dr. Harlan, he said. I need to brief you on the situation. The creature outside is classified as a Vrethkai, which is a Kreth, bioengineered apex predator with documented kills across 11 planetary encounters. Its venom causes neurological shutdown. Its sonic output can cause permanent psychological damage. The Kreth have deployed it as a psychological weapon, and Executor Voss is personally overseeing. Harlan had stopped listening somewhere around the word Venom. He was looking at the container, not at its size, not at its cables. He was watching the movement inside it the way he had watched 10,000 animals over 30 years. Reading rhythm, reading weight, reading the language that creatures speak when they do not know anyone is listening. How long has it been in that container? He said. Park blinked. That is not, I do not know. That information is not. Harlan nodded slowly to himself. Long time, he said. You can see it in the way it moves. No flow to it. Just impact. That is not aggression. That is frustration. Park stared at him. Dr. Harlan, the Kreth are threatening to release that thing unless we... I know what they are threatening, Harlan said pleasantly. He took another sip of coffee. Let me see it up close. The Kreth delegation had been informed through cold and formal diplomatic channels that the human team required an examination of the creature before any further discussions could proceed. Director Voss had framed it with a particular kind of polite firmness that made it sound reasonable, even where it was not. Humanity could not conduct negotiations under duress from an animal exhibiting signs of medical distress. This was a matter of basic interspecies ethical standards. The Kreth translators had struggled with the phrase medical distress as applied to the Vrethkai. The closest equivalent in the Kreth language was something like suffering of livestock. Executor Voss had gone completely still when the translation reached him. The silence around him had the quality of a room full of people holding their breath. Then he had agreed, not because he respected the request, because he wanted the humans close to the container. He wanted them to hear it. He wanted them to feel what was inside. He was certain that when the human healer, their word for what Harlan was translated roughly to, caretaker of lesser things, got within 20 meters of the container and heard what lived inside it, the negotiations would end immediately. Voss was a man who had used the Vrethkai before. He knew what proximity to it did to people. He did not know Dr. Cormac Harlan. The Kreth formed a corridor. Soldiers in ceremonial armor standing in 2 lines. The container at the end. Voss himself standing to the side with his arms folded and his expression already written in the language of victory. Harlan walked down the thong written in the thong corridor with his patched case and his thermos and his reading glasses still pushed up on his head. He did not walk fast. He did not walk slow. He walked at exactly the pace of a man who has a boy's job to do and is thinking about how to do it. 20 meters from the container. The sound hit him, that low, terrible frequency that bypassed the ears and went straight into the body. 2 of Harlan's medtechs behind him stumbled. Park made a small, involuntary sound. Even 3 of the Kreth soldiers shifted their weight. Harlan stopped. He set his coffee down on the ground, very carefully. He crouched in front of the container vents. He put his scanner slowly to the vent opening and held it there for 30 seconds, watching the readings dot. Then he exhaled through his nose. The sound he made was not fear. It was not awe. It was the particular soft exhale of a doctor who has just confirmed the diagnosis he was already fairly sure about and is now thinking about treatment options. Poor thing, he said. Quietly. The words moved through the corridor. Harlan had not said them loudly, but the silence was complete enough that everyone heard. The Kreth soldiers looked at each other. Voss went very still in a different way than before. Harlan stood. He turned to the Kreth delegation. He was polite and direct the way he always was. "I need permission to open the container for a full examination," he said. "I'm seeing signs of a fracture in the left rear limb. Respiratory irregularity. Probable chronic infection in at least 2 of the dorsal spine nodes. This animal has been in a space that is too small for too long, and it has not received adequate medical attention. I want to sedate it, perform a proper assessment, and begin treatment." The silence after he spoke was enormous. One of the Kreth diplomatic aides leaned toward the translator. The translator leaned toward another aide. Voss stared at Harlan with an expression that a human might have called disbelief, but on a Kreth face looked more like the moment before a storm. "You pity the Vrethkai," Voss said. His voice was very controlled. Harlan looked at him. "I do not pity it," he said simply. "I see a patient. There is a difference. Pity does not help anyone. Treatment does." Voss took one step forward. He was considerably taller than Harlan. He used that height the way powerful people often do, as its own kind of language. "The Vrethkai is the most feared creature in known space," he said. 11 civilizations surrendered at the sight of it. It has killed 17 Kreth handlers. You stand before it and speak of treatment." Harlan nodded. "I do," he said, "because fear and pain look the same from the outside sometimes. And what I am seeing in that container looks a lot more like pain than power." He picked his coffee back up off the ground behind. Voss, a young Kreth soldier, had moved slightly closer to the container than his position required. He was looking at the vents. His name was Ithrik. He was 23 years old and had grown up being told the Vrethkai was the greatest thing the Dominion had ever made. He was looking at the vents with an expression no one around him noticed. Not Voss, not his unit commander, but Harlan noticed. Harlan always noticed the ones who were watching. He said nothing. He waited. He finished his coffee and set the empty thermos in his case and clicked. It opened and started going through his equipment with the unhurried focus of a man who fully expected to begin work very shortly. Permission came 20 minutes later, not warmly, not graciously. It came through a tight-faced Kreth aide, who delivered it like something being handed over under protest, and Voss did not look at Harlan when it was delivered, but it came. Harlan put on his gloves. He looked at his 2 medtechs. He looked at the container. "All right," he said. "Let us see what we are working with." The container door opened with a sound like the whole universe exhaling. And Dr. Cormac Harlan walked in. The inside of the container smelled like old blood and something chemical, and underneath all of it something organic and alive. That filled the lungs in a way that made the body want to step back. Harlan stepped forward. The Vrethkai was in the far end of the container, pressed against the wall the way large animals press against walls when the space they are in is too small, and they have given up trying to find a way out. It was enormous. Even in the low light, Harlan could see the full weight of it. The armor plates of its hide that layered over each other like natural, shielding the thick neck and the long low head and the spines along its back that should have been standing fully upright with aggression, but were lying flat. Flat spines on a creature like this did not mean calm. It meant exhausted. The Vrethkai turned its head toward him. Its eyes were the color of deep amber, and they were watching him with the particular kind of attention that an animal gives when it has decided it does not have the energy to be afraid of anything new. Harlan stood still. He had learned this at 24 years old from a mentor named Lula Ademi, who had spent 40 years working with large African land mammals. She had told him, when you walk into the space of a suffering animal, the first thing you give it is time. You do not rush. You do not reach. You let it understand that you are not a new threat. You let it do the math on you and come to its own conclusions. Harlan stood still for 2 full minutes. Then he took one slow step. The Vrethkai's head moved. The amber eyes tracked him. One of the dorsal spines lifted slightly. Not fully erect, not aggressive, just a twitch of reflex. Then it settled. He took another step. Behind him in the open doorway, his 2 medtechs waited. Outside the container, the Kreth soldiers stood in absolute silence, and Executor Voss watched through the observation glass that his aide had quietly set up without being asked. Because Voss, whatever his politics, was not a man who looked away. Sub-Commander Ithrik stood at the very edge of the group closest to the container entrance. No one had told him to stand there. He had simply moved there, the way a person moves towards something they cannot quite stop thinking about. Inside the container, Harlan had covered half the distance to the Vrethkai. He was talking as he walked, low and even and unhurried. Not words with meaning exactly, just sound. The sound of a human voice in a low, calm register. He had talked to horses like this, to elephants, to a badly injured polar bear once who had taken a full hour to accept that Harlan was not there to make things worse. Talking was not about language. It was about frequency. It was about telling the animal in the only way that crossed every species barrier. I am not in a hurry, and I am not afraid, and I mean to help you. He crouched 3 meters from the Vrethkai. He ran the scanner slowly. He watched the readings come in, and his face did the thing faces do when numbers confirm what the body already knew, a settling small weighted exhale. Fractured left rear limb, he said quietly to his medtech, who was relaying notes from the doorway. Old fracture. Badly healed. Looks like 2, possibly 3 years. Secondary fractures in the surrounding bone from repeated weight compensation. 2 infected spine nodes, the 4th and 7th on the dorsal line. You can see the swelling from here if you know what to look for. Dehydration is significant. Respiratory pattern is arrhythmic, which combined with the neurological scan suggests. He paused. He looked at the reading more carefully. A sensory amplification disorder. Congenital possibly, or triggered by chronic pain. It means everything it feels at a higher intensity than it should. He looked up from the scanner at the Vrethkai. It has been in pain, he said. Not for weeks. For years. Maybe longer. He said it quietly and with no drama because he was a doctor, and doctors state facts. But the words moved through the container and out the open door, and into the listening air, and something about them landed in the watching crowd differently than Voss had intended anything today to land. The sedation process took 40 minutes. Harlan did not use a long-range injection. He worked closer than his medtechs were comfortable with, building proximity, building the animal's tolerance of him in small patient increments until he was close enough to place the sedation correctly. The Vrethkai did not charge him. It watched him. At one point, when he was very close, its enormous head turned and its amber eye was level with his face, and the 2 of them looked at each other for a moment that Harlan would never describe to anyone because he did not think he had the words for it. Then he placed the sedation. The Vrethkai went down slowly. Not all at once. It lowered like something very heavy finally being allowed to rest, and the sound it made as it settled to the floor was not a roar or a shriek. It was a long, deep exhale that moved the air in the container. Harlan got to work. He set the leg. It was long, difficult work. The old fracture had healed crooked, and the bone had built compensatory structures around it that had to be carefully navigated. His hands moved with the quiet precision of someone who has done hard things so many times that the hands have developed their own memory. He drained the infected spine nodes. He administered fluids through a line that his medtechs ran while he held steady on the leg. He treated the spine node sites with a compound his ship's medical lab had synthesized from the scanner. Data, a broad-range antimicrobial adapted for Kreth origin biology. For the neurological condition, he had something that was not a cure but was a management. A compound that would lower the sensory amplification, reduce the volume of a world that had been screaming at the creature for years. He administered it slowly. He watched the Vrethkai breathe. The breathing changed. Not dramatically, not immediately, but over 20 minutes the arrhythmic pattern, that stuttering uneven rhythm of a body always braced, began to smooth. The intervals between breaths lengthened. The body on the container floor seemed to not relax exactly, but settle, in a way that was different from sedation, deeper, like something that had been gripping hard for a very long time had simply and quietly let go. Harlan sat back on his heels. "It screams because it hurts," he said. He was talking to his medtech, but the container carried sound. He had been inside the heads of enough suffering animals to know that what looks like rage from the outside is almost always something simpler and worse on the inside. Outside the container, nobody spoke. Voss had been standing at the observation glass for 3 hours. He had not moved. He had not looked away. His face was unreadable in the way that faces become unreadable when they are working very hard not to show what they are feeling. Ithrik had stepped fully inside the container doorway at some point without being asked, and nobody had stopped him. He was looking at the Vrethkai on the floor, the creature that had been the centerpiece of his whole understanding of what the Dominion was and what made it powerful. It looked smaller somehow, not in size. It was still vast and armored and extraordinary, but it looked present in a way it had not before. It looked like something that was actually here in this moment, rather than simply enduring. Voss entered through the main door. He did not announce himself. He simply walked in and stood over Harlan, who was wrapping the leg in thermal support fabric and making notes. "You have weakened it," Voss said. His voice was quiet, which was worse than if it had been loud. "You have taken its edge. You have made it soft. Whatever it was when we brought it here, it will not be that now." Harlan finished the wrap. He smoothed the edge of it down. Then he stood and looked at Voss with the same calm expression he had been wearing all day. "I have not weakened it," he said. "For the first time in years, it is not in pain. You may find that makes it considerably more dangerous, a predator at full capacity, rather than a predator acting out of desperation. Or you may find it is less interested in fighting because it no longer needs to be in a constant state of survival. Either outcome is healthier than what you had before." He looked at Voss steadily. "What you had before was not power," he said. "It was suffering. And you were using the suffering as a weapon. There is a difference. I hope you can see it." Voss stared at him for a long time. Then he turned and walked out of the container without a word. Harlan watched him go. Then he looked at Ithrik, who was still standing in the doorway, looking at the sleeping Vrethkai. He said nothing to the young soldier. He just picked up his medical case and filed the xenobiology welfare report. 2 copies sent simultaneously to Human Diplomatic Command and to the Kreth Dominion Science Division as professional courtesy, and walked out into the fading light of an alien sun. Behind him the Vrethkai breathed, slow, even, without pain, for possibly the first time in years. On the first morning, the Vrethkai woke alone. The container was gone. It had been replaced in the night by a temporary enclosure the humans had assembled 3 times, the size of the transport pod and open on 2 sides to the alien air. The ground beneath it was not metal. It was the actual ground, dry-packed soil and low-flat rock, and something close to what the Vrethkai had been designed from and not seen in years. It woke slowly, cautiously, testing each limb before it moved the way an animal does when it has learned that waking hurts. The left rear leg did not hurt. It held weight. Not perfectly. Not without some stiffness. But it held, and that was something the Vrethkai had not experienced in so long that it stood on that leg for a full minute before it moved. Just stood on it and felt the ground through it and did nothing else. It moved to the edge of the enclosure. It looked out at the compound and the ships and the strange pale sky of a planet it had been brought to without being asked. It did not shriek. It made no sound at all. It simply stood and breathed and looked. When Harlan arrived with the morning feeding, it stood back and watched him from the far end of the enclosure. He did not look at it directly. He set the food, a synthesized nutritional compound his ship lab had built from the scanner data, at the enclosure entrance and stepped back and sat down on a crate and opened his thermos. He had work to do on his datapad, and he did it without urgency, without any performance of ignoring the creature. He simply had things to do, and he was doing them. The Vrethkai watched him for 40 minutes before it moved toward the food. It ate with the focused intensity of something that had been underfed for a long time and knew it. When it was done, it went back to its corner and lay down and looked at Harlan from there. Harlan nodded once in its direction. Then he went back to his notes. On the second morning, it stood at the far side of the enclosure when he arrived. When he set the food down and returned to his crate, it did not wait 40 minutes. It moved toward the food after 20. Then it stood near the food for a while and looked at him, and he looked back, briefly, honestly, and then looked away again. On the third morning, it was standing near the entrance when he came. It watched him the whole time. When he set the food down and stood up, the Vrethkai was closer than it had been before, and for a moment the space between a 58-year-old veterinarian and a 4-meter apex predator was very small and very quiet. Harlan held still. He breathed steadily. The Vrethkai's amber eyes moved over his face. Something in them was not the flat, exhausted gaze of the first morning. Something was working behind those eyes. Some assessment, some process that had no name in any language. Then it moved away and ate. Harlan exhaled and sat down on his crate and poured himself a coffee, and his hands were perfectly steady, which was something he was privately proud of. On the fourth morning, Sub-Commander Ithric was waiting for him at the compound gate. He was out of uniform. Not in civilian clothes exactly. Kreth did not have casual clothing in the same way humans did, but he was not in ceremonial armor. He was younger than Harlan had realized. Up close, he looked like what he was, a young man with something sitting heavily on his mind. "I want to understand what you did," he said, without any preamble. To the Vrethkai, "I want to understand how it works." Harlan looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the enclosure. "Walk with me," he said. They walked. Harlan talked. Not in the formal way of a lecture or a diplomatic exchange, but in the plain, direct way he talked to anyone about work he had spent his life doing. He explained the fracture, the infection, the neurological amplification that had been turning every sensation into pain for years, possibly longer. He explained what chronic pain does to behavior, how a creature in constant pain becomes a creature defined by that pain. Its whole personality built around trying to manage something that never stops. Ithric listened without interrupting. He was the kind of person who listened the way smart people listen, not waiting for space to talk, but actually absorbing. So it was never what we thought it was, Ithric said quietly. Harlan considered the question carefully. He did not want to be dismissive of what the Vrethkai had been. The creature was extraordinary. The genetics were extraordinary. The design, even with all its cruelty, was extraordinary. It was what it was, he said. It was also in pain. Those two things can both be true. The Vrethkai is a real and genuine danger. I would not want to be in the enclosure with it when it is healthy and does not know me. But what you were using, what you brought here as a weapon, that was not the creature at its true nature. That was the creature at its worst. You were weaponizing suffering. And suffering was the performance. Underneath the performance, there was always just an animal trying to survive. Ithric was quiet for a long while. Then he said something that Harlan thought about for the rest of his life. "We have never treated it," he said. "In 400 years of using it, we have never once asked what it needed. We just pointed it at things and let its pain do the work." They were standing at the enclosure fence now. Inside, the Vrethkai was lying in the morning sun. Its spines were at rest. Its breathing was even. When it saw Harlan at the fence, it lifted its head and held his gaze for a moment with those amber eyes. Then it lowered its head and went back to resting. Ithric stared. "It knows you," he said. "Not me exactly," Harlan said. "It knows that I am not a threat. There's a difference. When something has been in pain for a very long time and someone removes the pain, it does not forget. Animals do not forget kindness. They do not have the words for it, but they carry it somewhere, and it changes how they see the world." He looked at Ithric sideways. "The same is true for a lot of things," he said. "Not just animals." Ithric did not say anything to that, but something moved across his face, not quite an emotion, but the shape of where an emotion would be. He looked at the Vrethkai for a long time. Inside the diplomatic compound, the talks had quietly resumed. Director Voss was back at the table. The atmosphere had changed in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The Kreth delegation was still firm, still proud, still not offering easy concessions. But something in the tone had shifted. The theatrical certainty that Vaez had arrived with, the absolute, bone-deep confidence of a civilization that had never lost, had developed a small crack. Not in their position, in their certainty about themselves. They had brought their greatest weapon to end a negotiation. A human had looked at their greatest weapon and seen something they had never seen in 400 years of ownership. They did not know what to do with that. Voss had not come back to the enclosure after the first night, but his aides had reported to him every morning. They told him what the Vrethkai was doing, how it was eating, how it was moving. They told him about the steady improvement, and Voss listened to each report with a face that revealed nothing and dismissed his aides and sat alone for periods that his staff noted were longer than usual. On the fourth afternoon, Harlan received a message. It was from the Kreth Science Division. Formal and brief and written in the precise, careful language of an organization that is asking for something it is not entirely comfortable asking for. They wanted the full medical report, not just the summary he had sent as professional courtesy. The full assessment, the treatment protocol, the neurological findings. They wanted to understand what had been wrong with the Vrethkai. Harlan read the message twice. Then he sent the full report, without conditions, without negotiations, without asking for anything in return. He included his personal contact details and a note that said, "If you have questions about the findings or the ongoing treatment protocol, I am available." Park found him doing this and looked at the screen. "You are just giving it to them," he said. Harlan shrugged. "It helps the animal," he said. "That is the job." Park was quiet for a moment. "You know what you have done here," he said eventually. "You know what this whole thing has actually been." Harlan capped his thermos. "I treated a sick animal," he said simply. "Everything else is above my pay grade." He said it with the particular smile of a man who knows exactly what he has done and has chosen not to make a large thing of it, because the animal is the point and not the politics. Outside in the enclosure, the Vrethkai lay in the alien sun with its repaired leg stretched out, and its amber eyes half closed, and its breathing slow and even and completely without pain. It was not the beast that 7 civilizations had fled from. It was also not less than that. It was something the Kreth Dominion had never made room for in 400 years. It was the Vrethkai without its suffering. And what that was, what it truly was underneath all those years of pain, not even Harlan could say yet. But he was looking forward to finding out. The agreement was signed on a Tuesday morning under a sky the color of pale copper dot. It was not a perfect agreement. No agreement ever is. The Outer Reach colonies remained under human sovereignty. All 17 settlements, all 240,000 people. The Kreth did not get the buffer zone they wanted. They did not get the resource corridor. They did not get the proof that humanity could be pushed. What they got was a 10-year ceasefire with structured renewal terms, a joint trade framework for the Outer Reach border region, and a formal acknowledgement from the human diplomatic mission that the Kreth Dominion was to be engaged as a full partner in all future negotiations concerning the border sectors. Voss signed it. He signed it without warmth and without ceremony. He put his mark on the document and set the pen down and looked at Voss across the table and said nothing. She nodded once. He nodded once. And that was the ceasefire. Afterward, in the empty negotiating room, Voss stood at the window for a long time. Park came and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. "He is angry," Voss said eventually. Park nodded. He came here to win something that would prove what they already believed about themselves. He's leaving without it. Voss was quiet. She was watching the Kreth delegation crossing the compound toward their ship. Voss walked in front as he always did, straight-backed, unhurried, still looking like a man who had never been wrong about anything. But there was something different in it now. Not defeat. It was more like the look of a man who had encountered a question he did not have an answer for and could not stop thinking about it. They still could have won, she said. They still have more firepower, more territory, more soldiers. None of that has changed. Then what changed? Park asked. Voss thought about it for a moment. We made them see themselves, she said. The Vrethkai was their power, the proof of what they were. They had carried it for 400 years as a symbol of everything the Dominion stood for. And we looked at it, and the first thing we asked was, is it all right? Is it in pain? Does it need help? She paused. You cannot do that without making people think about what they built, what they have been doing with it. Whether the thing they were proud of was actually what they thought it was. Outside, Voss stopped at the foot of the warship ramp. He turned. He looked across the compound at the temporary enclosure where the Vrethkai lay in the morning light. He stood there for a long time, long enough that his aides gathered at the ramp and waited. Without speaking, he was not a sentimental man. His civilization had been built on the understanding that power was the only real language, and that everything else was decoration. He had believed this completely, and had never had a reason not to. He was having a reason now. He turned and walked up the ramp. The ship lifted 3 hours later. Ithric was not on it. He had submitted a formal request the night before. Transfer to the Dominion Diplomatic Liaison Division. The request cited a desire to develop expertise in interspecies relations. His commanding officer had reviewed it twice because he thought he had misread it the first time. He approved it because technically it was within protocol and because he did not know what else to do with it. Ithric stood at the edge of the landing area and watched the warship rise through the copper sky and disappear into the cloud layer. He stood there until it was completely gone. Then he turned back toward the compound. He had one more thing to do before his own transport arrived. He went to the enclosure. The Vrethkai was awake. It was standing near the center of the space, not pacing, not pressing against the walls. Standing in the open with its repaired leg bearing full weight and its dorsal spines completely at rest. It looked at Ithric when he arrived at the fence. He had been told not to enter the enclosure. He had no intention of entering the enclosure. He simply stood at the fence and looked at the creature that had been the symbol of everything. He had been raised to believe in Dot. It looked back at him. He did not know what he expected to feel. Something resolving, perhaps. Some clean emotion that would tell him what this moment meant. Instead, it was more complicated than that. A mixture of grief and wonder and something that did not have a name but felt like the place where old certainty used to live before it was replaced by a question. He had grown up being told the Vrethkai was strength. What he understood now was that the Vrethkai had always been strength, but the Dominion had been using its suffering and calling that strength. And those were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing. And the difference between them was a gap he had spent 4 days staring into. And he was not done yet. He stayed at the fence for 15 minutes. Then he nodded once at the creature and walked away. Harlan was packing when Voss found him at his shuttle. He had his case patched and battered and considerably heavier now with xenobiology samples and the data from the treatment, and his thermos and his reading glasses still on his forehead. He was moving with the efficiency of someone who has done this often enough to have a system. Voss stopped in front of him. She was not a person who made big gestures, but she held out her hand and he shook it. "You did something important," here she said. Harlan looked genuinely puzzled for a moment. "I treated a sick animal," he said. "You did more than that." He considered arguing. Then he seemed to decide it was not worth it and just nodded. "The welfare report is being transmitted to the Kreth Science Division in full," he said. "They have the full protocol, the neurological data, everything. The Vrethkai will need follow-up care for at least 6 months and a permanent habitat modification. Someone from the Dominion Medical Division will need training on the treatment protocol." He looked at her. "If you want, I can come back for that. If it helps." Voss smiled. It was a real smile, not the diplomatic version. "I will send you the schedule," she said. He nodded. He picked up his case. "One more thing," Voss said. He stopped. "Were you afraid?" she asked. When he walked into the container, Harlan, and thought about it the way he thought about everything. "Actually, and without performance, I was worried about the leg," he said. "A fracture that old improperly healed. There is always a risk of re-injury during sedation. You have to be very careful with the weight distribution during recovery." He looked at her. "Afraid of the animal," he said. "No, I was sad for it. There is a difference. Fear keeps you at a distance. Sadness walks you forward." He picked up his case and walked up the ramp. Voss stood in the empty landing area for a moment after the shuttle door closed. Then she walked to the enclosure one last time. The Vrethkai was lying down now in the thin morning sun. The enclosure around it was quiet. The compound behind her was mostly cleared. In a few hours, everything here would be packed and gone, and this patch of alien ground would go back to being empty neutral territory where nothing had happened, except something had happened. She looked at the Vrethkai. It lifted its great head and looked back at her. Those amber eyes calm and present and fully here in a way that they had not been 5 days ago. No shriek, no impact against the walls. Just breathing, deep and slow and utterly without pain. Humanity had faced the most feared weapon in the known galaxy. They had not fired a single shot. They had not retreated. They had not signed away a single colony or a single person or a single kilometer of what belonged to them. They had sent a tired doctor with a patched case and a thermos of coffee. And he had walked into the dark and found not a monster but a patient. And that was the thing. The Kreth Dominion would carry home on that warship and could not put down and could not stop turning over. Not the ceasefire. Terms not the diplomatic language, not the signed agreement. The image of a Human man sitting quietly beside the most terrifying creature in known space, talking to it in a low voice while he said it's broken. Leg. The image of something that had been a weapon for 400 years breathing easily for the first time. Voss turned and walked back toward the compound. Behind her, the Vrethkai lifted its head toward the alien sun. The light moved across its armored hide like water. Its spines were at rest. Its breathing was slow. It did not shriek. It had no reason to anymore. The pain was gone, and in the silence where the pain used to live, something older and quieter had moved in. Something that was simply and completely itself. The Vrethkai closed its amber eyes and rested.